Uh,
I'm happy
Great.
to
Well,
get going if everyone's here.
sorry.
I'm happy to get going if everyone's here.
Yeah, sure. Just going to say, in the interest of speed, let's just launch straight in. Anthony, thank you very much for
Yeah,
doing the session for us.
that's okay.
Off you go.
Thank you. So it's lovely to meet you all, albeit virtually. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about the connection between the ancient world and the modern world, ancient history and modern history. And the reason for that is because actually, when you bring the two together, you get a better understanding of each. So you get a better understanding of the ancient world by understanding how perhaps fascist states sought to re orientate themselves through an exploration of the Roman or Greek sense of a deep past. But likewise, you get a good sense of kind of modern history as well by thinking, well, what are they using and why are they using it? So the talk today, albeit in 30 minutes, as fast as I can, is designed to introduce you to some of these ideas and some of these concepts. So long as you can all see the slides, you'll be kind of guided through a series of different ideas and different images. But all I want you to really walk away with from today is an acknowledgement of that connection, but also the way in which that connection can better or can help us understand both areas of history. So that's my main kind of ambition today. So one thing I want us to recognize straight away is that when we look at the fascist world and when we think about modern fascist states, I think we all kind of understand that they do present an experience of that ancient world, that they do consider Rome especially, but Greece also, and they're looking for certain characteristics. So the image I'm starting with today is an image that might be familiar to some of you. This is Rome's first emperor. This is the Emperor Augustus. This is the figure who takes the dying embodiment of a republic and transforms it into something that is very different, but he hides that transformation. And it's Augustus that becomes ever more important as these modern fascist states look to that ancient world and look to the Roman past, especially, to kind of create their own sense of identity. So it's Augustus that I think becomes ever more important. And this is particularly true for this figure here, who I have no doubt every one of you will recognize. This is, of course, the Italian dictator. This is Benito Mussolini. And even in this image, so just one kind of isolated photograph, what you're getting a sense of is that fascist present, that fascist idea and ambition for the future, but you're also getting the Roman past, and it's deliberately placed here behind Benito Mussolini. So you're seeing that connection between an image here of Julius Caesar, who is crucially important in the early years of the fascist Italian dictatorship, who then becomes eclipsed by his adoptive son, his great nephew Augustus, who is the first of Rome's emperors. But the reason this image is so valuable is because it provides us a really clear window into the way in which fascist states engage with, and often quite an explicit and uncomfortable way, the ancient past. We could step away from Mussolini, and we could also look to Nazi Germany, and that's what I will be ending today's session with. What you see here, again, is a figure who needs no introduction, a figure you perhaps are all teaching about already, and what Hitler's doing here, and the reason this picture is important is because, once again, he's engaging with, in a slightly different way, the Roman past. And the German experience of the exploration of classical ideas is very different to the Italian. Even when they're perhaps walking through the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Colosseum, nonetheless, they're experiencing it in a slightly different way. And they're manipulating that Roman past or that ancient world for slightly different reasons or with slightly different ambitions. There is another connection here as well. So I'm kind of sitting here today as an ancient historian with a little bit of knowledge about modern history, but an ancient historian first and foremost. And I need to be kind of aware of where some of my sources come from. So the image I put up on the screen here, the Res Gestae of the Divine Augustus, the kind of autobiography of Rome's first emperor that you see here, it looks overwhelmingly Roman, and it kind of is. It's a Roman source, but it's a Roman source that's been given life under fascist leadership. This is a source that has been deemed important and crucial for Benito Mussolini's fascist state, and thus a lot of money, time, and energy has been spent on restoring this to the center of his kind of city of Rome. So there is a weird connection here that becomes uncomfortable, and I want you to be aware of that. Modern historians like me who are studying the ancient world sometimes will be engaging with artifacts that were perhaps unearthed under fascist leadership, and they may have served rather nefarious purposes during that time period. So all I'm going to be doing today then is talking about this connection, the connection of the ancient world to fascist Italy first, and then on to Nazi Germany. And as soon as we begin talking about Benito Mussolini's Italy, what we're really talking about is this idea called Romanità, which can be translated in a number of different ways. Some simply say Romanity, which is kind of an awkward term, or Romanness. This ambition to engage with a very distinctive element of the Italian European past and an attempt to kind of enhance that sense of a kind of shared history or a shared culture through a focus on all things Rome. And so, what Romanità means, certainly for the fascist state, is a crucial building block or a way that they seek to construct their own identity. So, they're using the classical heritage to reform their own history, often to rewrite it, not entirely truthfully, but to manipulate the historical past for their own contemporary needs. And sometimes that can be as simple as, or as uncomfortable as, taking up the images of Rome. So things like Senatus Populusque Romana, SPQR, using that type of language, or using the Roman eagle, using kind of Romanesque statues or sculptures to embody the kind of contemporary fascist ambition. And sometimes that is just lifted from the past, but often it is changed, and sometimes those changes can be quite subtle, and it has a very clear historical purpose. What I want everyone to be aware of is that when the fascist government in Italy start doing this, they're working closely with the surrounding academy. They're working closely with archaeologists, classicists, specialists in ancient language, other kind of disciplines, and sometimes they're working quite hand in hand. What they're also working through is an already kind of strong appetite for a Roman sense of past as a way to creating a new Italian identity. And that's to do with the nature of the Italian state from the 19th century into the early 20th. But there's a historical purpose here. And when we look at this, and you'll see certainly with Mussolini that sometimes these are direct links, i.e., Mussolini becomes Julius Caesar to begin with, and then transforms into a new Augustus. But you'll also see historical mistakes. You'll see historical problems, and you'll also notice how some things just don't work at all. They shouldn't work, and yet this complex rewriting of history allows them to for the contemporary need. The best example, I would argue, for seeing this in action is a big monumental museum exhibition, the Mostra Augustea della Romanità. And this ran from 37 to 38, so it's coming quite late into Mussolini's tenure of power. And it's a clear, tangible, vivid example of how the Italian government seek to reincorporate the Roman past into their own message. And the reason I like to use this is because, and it works actually quite well, the fact that we're doing it over Zoom, is we can kind of walk through the exhibition together. We can see the exhibition as it was meant to be seen by contemporaries, and we can also recognize the importance of the exhibition to the fascist government in reshaping their story and their future, as well as their past, but also to the academy that are kind of supporting and upholding this. You know, they're very important, influential historians and classicists and others who are creating this. And that is something we need to acknowledge as a discipline. That's something we need to be aware of, that close connection between elements of historians or classicists and the ruling regimes in both Italy and Germany. This is from the opening. So again, I'm just going to work us through some contemporary photographs that you can find online. You can see Mussolini there, but as soon as you look at Mussolini there, what you're also hopefully drawn to is not just a crowd of individuals, a mixture of fascist government officials, as well as members of the academy, but you see the kind of surrounding urban, almost temple-like structure that is exposing the ancient world, that is engaging with distinctive elements of the Roman past. So even a cursory glance through that, with the kind of photo quality that we have, allows us to recognize that actually what we're seeing here is an artificial creation of Romanity, an artificial creation of Romanita, where you might have these kind of glorious, glorified images alongside military prowess. You know, you don't have to look far to see both contemporary fascist militarism and Roman militarism. You know, the idea of the legions, the eagle, the supremacy of the Roman army. These are crucial cornerstones in how the fascists kind of self-identify, how they look in the mirror and see in themselves the heirs of ancient Rome, but a very distinctive ancient Rome that they're harking back to. And then you see, of course, that Mussolini is placed at the kind of center. He belongs within these kind of shadows. He belongs with that Roman world. So there is some subtlety to these images and the narrative that the photographers and the surrounding officials are seeking to create. It was inaugurated on the 23rd of September in 1937. Mussolini, unsurprisingly, gave a speech. It wasn't the only speech that was delivered. A couple of others that talked about elements of the Roman history were put forward as well. But it's a clear example of this connection. And again, you look at the backdrop. Don't look at the front and center. Look at the backdrop. Look at where this speech is being delivered. Look at the language that surrounds the speech. Look at the images that have been created sometimes from plasticast copies of ancient monuments and ancient artifacts. And what it really tells us, sometimes subtly, sometimes not, is the connection between the ancient and the modern, and how the fascist state here is using everything they can that they consider positive of Rome that basically distills down into power, a form of hard power, power that they can engage with, power that they can imitate, power that they can then enact. And that's what we're seeing here. And you also notice, I hope, the use both of Italian a little bit later, as I'll show you in some elements of this museum exhibition, but also Latin, and Latin becoming ever more important as not just a language of fascism, but a language that the fascists can use to demonstrate they are now the Roman Empire reborn. And that brings with it all those kind of worrying, unsettling echoes of what we know the fascists ultimately end up doing. It ends, forgive the typo, everyone, it doesn't end a century before, it ends in 38. And again, it's presented as this wonderful success, this great monument to the Roman past and the fascist future. But that is a lie. You know, this is not really, strictly speaking, a success that we could measure or that the fascists would measure. If you were to study, as some historians have done, the contemporary documentation really carefully in a number of the archives across Italy, what you'll notice is that numbers are down, that museum numbers actually are quite low considering the amount of money that has been spent. And one thing we certainly know is that communities beyond the city of Rome in kind of outlying towns and villages are not so gently encouraged to attend and are kind of shuttled in on various trains to make these numbers appear inflated. But it's not the great success that Mussolini imagines it to be, even though so much money, time, and then energy has been put forward into creating it. What you would do then, if we were to travel back through time and actually walk through this museum exhibition, is we would see a number of different rooms that are designed to do very different things. What you'll notice immediately is the expansion of empire. The fact that, of course, the fascist experience of empire now has a clear antecedent in Rome, and that the two belong together. And this is demonstrated through artificial narratives written in Latin, with little bits of Italian as well, but also crucial images that create this narrative of war. That's what you would see here. You see Italy, you see the way in which the Italian peoples themselves were conquered and were drawn into and collected within the wider power of Rome. And then you see this narrative, and again, part of this is quite nuanced. The sort of images, the heroes they're creating, the heroic elements they're trying to epitomize, but it's an artificial narrative that is focused on war, victory, and success. But also, and this is the crucial thing, the way in which ancient Romans epitomized or encapsulated the contemporary fascist ambitions towards morality and service, and this notion, of course, of imperial expansion. The Augustan legacy begins to fall a little bit when we get to this notion of a Roman Christian empire. And this is all to do, and I'm confident there'll be people in this virtual room who'll know this history far better than I will, to do with the relationship between the fascist government and the papacy in Rome. What the historians and museum creators have done here is create an artificial history. When Augustus is emperor, there is no real, of course, as you might expect, Christian unity across this world. Far from it. You know, that is kind of entirely impossible until the death of Christ, which comes later. And yet, what do we see here? What can we view? What can we recognize? That all of a sudden the Augustan Empire the peaceful empire, as Mussolini and his contemporaries are trying to argue, has become linked with this notion of Christianity. And that doesn't fit. So they're rewriting history. They're looking to a later Rome, perhaps the Rome of Constantine and after, and they're bringing together different strands of the ancient world to serve a contemporary purpose and to serve a kind of fascist need. And again, this is visible really clearly through the narrative. It's a little bit blurry, but you can see the numbers on the left, and it's Il Guerra, Il Guerra, Il Guerra, war, war, and war again. This narrative. What is perhaps most interesting, and certainly for modern historians in the audience, is that once you go through all these different Roman rooms, you find yourself in if I'm honest, the future. You find yourself in the fascist future that is built upon the shoulders, the bones, the skeletal remains of the Roman government. And that's what you see here, everyone. You see Mussolini's words now, given the same kind of strength or importance or centrality as those ancient Romans that have been used before. And you can see certain speeches, extracts from letters, famous moments. And that for me is kind of the best example of the way in which the fascist governments seek to use Romanita, but it can be seen all across Italy. And this is a little bit earlier. This is in the early 1930s. Mussolini gives back a famous statue of Julius Caesar to the city of Rimini. And you'll notice here, just as I quickly scroll through them, that you have all these different Roman images, and you have the statue of Caesar as well. So it's something you can find all across the fascist world. What I want to move on to now, and I'm conscious of time, so I've got 13 minutes, 12, sorry, minutes left to go, is to turn to Nazi Germany. And this is very different. I want you all to be aware of that. Although Rome is here, the understanding of Rome is rather more subtle and nuanced. And what the German government and the Nazi figures are seeking to do is engage a little bit more with the Greek ideas, so the Hellenistic ideas, especially about bodily purity, and through that relate it to their focus, their obsession with all things race. So it becomes very different, and it becomes actually, as you can tell, rather more uncomfortable to talk about. Even though I put the same 3 bullet points up there, they mean very different things to the Nazi audience. There's one example that I should highlight straight away. Some of you may have already read, and that is a book by Tacitus, famous second century, perhaps the greatest of all Roman historians. And he wrote a book called the Germania, that is kind of his ethnographic study of ancient Germanic peoples. And this became really important. And Christopher Krebs, in a really good book, has entitled this a most dangerous book because of what it says. And one thing that it says really clearly, even though it doesn't match the Aryan ideal, is that it presents this racial superiority, this idea of racial superiority. And of course, that type of language matches really clearly with what you expect from Hitler and all his underlings as well. I also want to flag up a couple of other theories, although most of us would be familiar for whatever reason, whether that's schooling or what we're teaching at the moment, with the notion of the Aryan myth. There are others that the Nazi intellectuals also present, and one of these is the Nordic theory, which uses an artificial sense of ethnic identity to engage, especially with the Greeks of the distant past, and to try and argue that the kind of lands of the north are somehow linked with ancient Greece, and use that as a way to distance Germany from Italy, fascist Italy and its Roman obsession, and also to give them an artificial sense of identity. But with the Nazi experiment, this becomes ever more focused on racial purity. And again, we can see that Aryan would be the first group, foundation and walls of all human creation, outward form determined by the changing traits of character. And again, it echoes really clearly that Tacitus quote from a few slides ago. You also can see from Hitler's own speeches and Hitler's own correspondence and writings that he is aware of both Greece and Rome, and he sees things that he can admire, but also things that he might work upon as well. Ancient world civilization can only flourish in states that are solidly organized, by which he means, of course, a lack of freedom, and that is true of the Roman world pretty much all the way through. There's a famous example from a speech delivered to one of the Antonine emperors, where the speaker says, "You give us as much freedom as we want, and if we had any more, that wouldn't be a good thing." This is exactly what Hitler is meaning here. Organization is not an empty term, it means control. Roman democracy, approximately the same rapport with German democracy that National Socialism has with your democracy. It was in truth an elitist oligarchy of the most extreme kind. And again, that's not a very subtle criticism of the ancient world. So Rome means slightly different things to the German audience. And then the Reich Minister for Science and Education, Bernard Rust. History is the history of the racially determined people. In lieu of the doctrine of ex oriente lux, there must be a firm conviction of the Western culture, Nordic peoples, and again, Greece and Rome and in other European countries. And you'll notice through all of these slides, everyone, we're looking at identity. We're thinking about racial purity and the Nazi writings and ideas and subverted ideologies upon that. But what you're also noticing straight away is that the ancient world is being used, but engaged with and challenged. So Rome could be distanced, but not in the same way that Mussolini might seek to use it, or as the kind of example of the museum exhibition will show us. Instead, now Rome is being used as a counterpoint, a counterstroke, and we begin to see this emergence of Greek ideas, Greek ideology, and also Greek imagery. So this image is a really famous one you can find in the British Museum, a discus thrower. I think you'd all look at that and recognize that is Greek rather than Roman. It feels classically Greek. It's classically Hellenistic. But also then you compare that to say this still from the image celebrating the kind of Nazi Olympics and the Olympiad, and you can see that kind of powerful correlation that is now not too subtle at all. This bodily image, this bodily perfection, this ambition for a kind of history of race that will match their own subverted logic and ideologies. And it's these types of images that we find all across Nazi Germany. And of course, we find it in the Olympia of 1936, where all of these images, which can be so kind of disturbing and unsettling to look at, are engaging with a very distinctive element of the Greek world. And it is this kind of Hellenism, this love of ancient Greece, which permeates the Nazi experience and exploration of the ancient world. They use Rome, but not in the same way, and not in the same way that they simply take ideas, they challenge them. But what they look to instead is that competitive edge of the ancient Greek world, that ambition for dominance, that kind of image that we can all find in Thucydides. If we look carefully or not, you see that the powerful do what they can, but also this notion on purity and purity visible through bodily image, bodily ideas, and above all this notion of an Aryan race. And again, we see the Greeks then becoming Nordic somehow, abundantly clear from their sculpture, the figure of the gods out of stone, shape of the skull, the expression on their faces. This tells us that they're basically in the minds of this individual, the writing of Races and Obligation, that these are the forebears of the Germans. So what can we say then? What have I tried to do as fast as I possibly can? Well, we can see that there is a connection here. There's a connection between the ancient world and the modern, and that in looking at both together, and I'm sitting here as an ancient historian, you get a better understanding both of 1930s, 1920s, 1940s politics, ideas, identity, and scholarship, as well as the Roman and the Greek past. And what it really tells us, I hope, is that actually in studying or teaching ancient history, we deepen our understanding of that 1930s, 1940s world, but also that it's necessary. Every ancient historian working today needs to be aware that some of the sources, some of the ideas, some of the archaeological finds they're using come to us through a really bloodstained past. They come to us through imperial expansion. They come through to us through obsession with racial purity and all the despicable acts that brings with it. They come to us through a contested history. And that's what I really want us to be aware of. This isn't meant to be easy to look at or to think about. It's meant to challenge us and to make us realize that actually the history we're using, that we're imagining is sanitized, is anything but. If I'm using the Res Gestae today, which I'm very well might do, then I'm using something that was celebrated in the fascist world of Italy. And that matters. And I need to be aware of that. And I need to think about what that can really tell me and why that might be so important. And with that, everyone, I'm happy to stop talking. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them, although we've got 5 minutes, I think. Is that right? So if anyone wants me to run through anything or needs me for anything.
We're a small group, so just unmute yourself and ask away.
If you need me for anything, please do ask.
I've got a question.
Hi, Christian.
Hello. Yes. You've talked about how the Nazis sort of co-opted various aspects of ancient, classical Greece. This idea of bodily perfection and competition. Did they make any? I mean, do you think that they kind of valued Spartan culture above all, or did they see value in Athenian culture? Did they make
So,
distinctions?
Christian, that's a really good question. If I was, so my instinctive response is Spartan, absolutely, and that actually goes back to the First World War as well, really clearly. But Athens poses a bit of a problem for them, as you might expect,
Mm,
because of course with Athens we have mob rule. That's a really cruel way of saying it, I know. Or we have this great demoskratia, this great kind of power of the people. But they do
mm,
navigate it, and they navigate it really well. So Spartan example of kind of discipline, service to the state, seen in the First World War, is built upon heavily all across Germany. And what I'm particularly interested in is kind of how university lecturers and speakers and thinkers and writers are incorporating that. So you see the Spartan myth really clearly. What you also see, however, is an awareness of Athenian power, and this is the crucial thing. So this is why I mentioned Thucydides, how the Athenians deal with their enemies, which to us looks really, I hope anyway, really cruel and offensive and aggressive. But of course, to
mm.
the Nazi state, if you ignore the notion of mob rule, then you can navigate that by saying, well, this is National Socialism, we're speaking for the people, or whatever else. You can say, well, look at how they deal with the people of Melos or whoever else. Look at how they deal with rivals. They defeat them, they crush them, and we can do something similar. And even in the kind of conflict between Sparta and Athens, it's a really good question, Christian. You see actually how they can expose the strengths of both because neither is willing to flinch. So it's a really,
Ah,
really good topic. So I'm really grateful for that one.
okay.
Thank you, Christian.
Brilliant. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if anyone wants to stay on, I'll just stop the recording for this